Hello, my name is Andrew Wright. I am a Rumble Fellow at Wayne State University in Detroit, and I'd like to talk to you today about an ongoing research project that I call Colleges, Communities, Humanities, Humanity, Liberating and Humanizing Higher Education in South Asia. And this presentation is for the Education in Crisis Conference through Oxford Education South Asia. It is a stereotype that when we talk about education and higher education in South Asia, we primarily talk about STEM. We think about the IITs, we think about the engineers that come out of higher education in India. And that's certainly a part of it, but there's also a real robust tradition of humanities education in South Asia. And you'll find many South Asian scholars who promote the study of literature and history and the arts. The crisis we're living through gives us the opportunity to think of higher education's role in the next crisis. We'll hope that in the next global crisis that scientists, researchers, and others from India provide the tools we need, such as vaccines, to get through the next crisis. We can also hope that India's philosophers, storytellers, and artists will be providing us with the narratives and ideas we need to get us through the next global crisis. To consider the role of humanities in changing the public sphere, we should think about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed as a very formative work. Paulo Freire talked about the banking concept of education, the idea of education that is considered by the teacher and granted to the students, a top-down kind of education. Freire advocated for humanizing education, building what he called conscientização, the deepening of the attitude of awareness characteristic of all emergence. We get this from the study of the humanities. My framework for talking about humanities education comes from a field called New Literacy Studies and the thinkers within that field. One point I want to clarify when I talk about New Literacy Studies. When I mentioned this to a scholar of South Asian studies that I was looking at higher education and bringing in the teachings of New Literacy Studies, this scholar asked me, isn't literacy a childhood concern? Isn't that a question about are we teaching children? And very clearly, to New Literacy Studies, literacy is a lifelong process. It is not just a question of whether children develop literacy, but what we do with literacy through life, how we value it in all spheres of our lives. The field of New Literacy Studies uses a particular vocabulary to talk about literacy that I think is very useful when applying literacy studies to cultural anthropology, to a particular region of the world such as South Asia. The first point that I'd make is that they use literacy as a count noun. Literacies. When we think of the kinds of literacy that are practiced within a community. Clearly in South Asia, we do know that there are different modalities of literacy. Different languages and dialects are written in different scripts. New technologies are shaping what literacy is capable of doing. The adoption of new technology has an influence on how people use these literacies. So it's clear we can't just talk about what is the percentage of literate people in South Asia. We have to talk about these different literacies. Likewise, New Literacy Studies focuses on what literacy practices are present in people's lives, and literacy events use a structured kind of literacy in people's lives to interact with written text in a formalized way. These photos represent some literacy practices that I saw within the year I was in India. Literacy practices including written signs at protest events, literacy practices including scripture in religious places, guidelines as to how to behave in public places, graffiti, literacy events such as qawwali singing, even the literacy involved with farmers' events sharing their own prized mangoes. During the pandemic and after the pandemic, these literacy practices and literacy events will continue in South Asia. They are an important part of people's lives. And I think higher education in the humanities is not the beginning point of these literacy practices, but higher education in the humanities can catalyze and enrich these literacy practices, and will during and after the pandemic. One of the first scholars of New Literacy Studies was named Brian Street. One of the ideas that Street emphasized was New Literacy Studies was a response to a common way of thinking about literacy that he called the deficit model. The deficit model is thinking of literacy in terms of illiteracy, pointing out who has problems with literacy, pointing out which areas of the world have problems with literacy, discounting the literacy practices that people are showing because those literacy practices are somehow considered deficient compared to standard literacy practices. This is significant because it forces us to consider a distinction, a line between dominant discourses and suppressed discourses, a self-evident discernment of right and wrong, good grammar, bad grammar, or we might have a little bit of attempt at fairness and say, well, this is non-standard language. It prevents us from looking at the literacy practices that are present in people's lives and recognizing their value as they are. This way of thinking about literacy reminds me in some ways of how we think about culture and how we think of development when our research takes us to the developing world. A transnational deficit model looks at the other in the world and identifies what deficits must be addressed so that those nations can find what we identify as prosperity. I want to question and critique the transnational deficit model. I do see it often perpetuated by scholars who mean well and who have done good scholarship, but still focus on the deficits and deficiencies rather than appreciating practices and cultures within particularly South Asia. This deficit model looks at a world as one-dimensional, sees only the distinctions and the deficits of this space. The transnational deficit model is often presupposing a strict difference between cultures, a dichotomy where one culture is irreconcilably different from others. I have seen, drawing on the work of Rahul Rao and Shanila Kojamulji, a concern that academia's view of South Asian countries is rather patronizing, particularly in their portrayal of women and LGBTQ people as in need of Western intervention. This seems condescending. This seems to look down on South Asia and other developing places. If we want our humanities education to reject the deficit model, humanities should build on, rather than importing, solutions to humanities education in the country. It can build on the literacy practices that are already in students' lives, using those as the starting point for further lessons. It can build on the South Asian traditions of humanities, the literature, art, and philosophy that is indigenous to South Asia. It can build on activism by South Asian groups, valuing what those groups are working on to change society. It can build on work being done in humanities by current scholars based in South Asia, valuing those voices first and foremost. The goal of humanities education is a liberational experience, a humanizing experience that improves the inner life of students and citizens. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, I would be thrilled to hear from you via email.